Hello everybody, this is Ruth again. This is Module 2 and the first part. We have our usual copyright warning that we need to take seriously. Then the objectives for this module. So on completion of this module you should be able to describe and evaluate the nature and role of the impact of industrial hazardous substances and controlled and uncontrolled exposures. Identify practical examples of the various forms of chemicals and other hazardous exposures in the workplace. Identify and evaluate the principles and theoretical knowledge underpinning the systematic management of hazardous substance risk and exposures. And develop and apply basic systems for the management of chemical and other physical hazardous risks in the hazardous risks and exposures in the workplace. We'll go through an introduction, we'll look at a bit of an overview of chemical and other hazardous substances, look at them at work, physical forms of hazardous substances, and then a bit on management and controls. The readings for this module are listed here and they'll come up again at the end of each section, and you can see that you can download them all. There's 3 readings and 2 PowerPoints that we want you to watch. So this module is going to explore the how and why of hazardous substance risks and the development and implementation of systematic control strategies for the prevention of exposures and injury. This requires a pluralistic approach underpinned by appropriate principles and theoretical knowledge. In later modules we'll explore the effects of workers and exposures to hazardous substances. This module examines systematic hazardous substance management, which builds on a fundamental risk management concepts that we discussed in Module 1, so risk, hazard and exposure. Every workplace and work type will have its own hazard types, its own chemicals and its own other hazardous substances. And while it's important that the management of these intrinsic hazards are linked to occupations and their specific environments, it's also necessary that we have more generically applicable strategies to manage exposures where risk quantification is complex or difficult to ascertain. There's a lot of concern today about the hazards posed by chemicals and other hazardous substances to the health and safety of the individual and the environment. There's good cause for this concern as the number and range of substances introduced into our society grows daily. It's been estimated that nearly 2 million chemicals are in existence, and the number is growing at a rate of thousands each year. More than 100,000 of these are in common use in industry and in the home, and very little is known about many of the hazards. Hazardous substances pose a threat to the environment through their manufacture, transport, storage and ultimate disposal. There's a long history, unfortunately, of industrial disasters involving hazardous substances, which continue to be quite common still in this world today. We really don't learn. Here's just a list of a few fairly notable international and a few local examples listed. That first one was back in 1978, where you had 200,000 tonnes of crude oil spilled, and that's resonance more recently. As you'd be aware, the Bhopal one was enormous, and it's a really interesting sociological study because it was an American company, it was working in India. The official estimates were 2,000 people killed. That was very few of the workers, of the US-based workers who got out pretty fast, but a lot of local people, and the unofficial estimates are up to 10,000 deaths with around 200,000 injuries. The Sims metal smelter one, 1987 in Melbourne, 4 deaths, 7 injuries. The Longford gas explosion, which you've probably heard about, in Victoria, which only 2 were killed, I'll say only in the nicest possible way, but that had quite significant resonance in terms of the management of disasters in Victoria and Australia and the systems that can go wrong. There was a lot of investigation. That one in the Netherlands, 22 deaths, lots of injuries and destruction of many homes, and that was an explosion in a fireworks factory. The Toulouse one in fertiliser factory, 2011. A fuel refinery explosion, 2005, 15 dead, 100 plus injured. And more disasters. The Buncefield UK one, 2005. There were no fatalities, but it really devastated the surrounding area. Connecticut, 2010, 27 injuries. The Gulf of Mexico, the next really big oil spill. Massive destruction to environment, 11 people killed, but really that one's had a lot more impact on the community than I think anyone ever imagined. Then the Fukushima one in 2011, and again just enormous in terms of not only the workers but the general population and the environmental damage, which, you know, much of it is considered to now be permanent. The fertiliser plant explosion in West Texas in 2013, so a recent one, where there are at least 14 people killed, lots injured, and a lot of buildings damaged or destroyed. In fact, most of that small town was wiped out. The last one that's mentioned there is the Wittenoom disaster, which has been described as Australia's greatest industrial disaster, and it's had enormous impact on huge numbers of people. Those estimates that are there of 700 cases of mesothelioma by 2020 is only considering the actual workers in the plant. There's huge ramifications for the whole town, the children, the partners of the workers, the extended families, and the whole town was built using the tailings from the mine for roads, for playgrounds, for sand pits, for it just goes on and on. So the exposure was enormous. So that one is an example of a chronic problem from a hazardous substance which is still ongoing, and you'll get more information about asbestos exposure in a future module. So not all incidences are acute events, and that's actually really important to remember, because we tend to hear about the ones that are sudden, acute and exciting and involve lots of emergency services and lots of devastation. We tend to hear more about the ones where there's an impact on the environment and the surrounding infrastructure, so homes, so where it spreads out into the community. To some extent, you know, killing workers is considered to be something that happens every day, but clearly is not acceptable. However, the hazards that are posed need to be kept into some sort of perspective. That chemicals are actually essential in our lives, and they've been responsible for a lot of advances in medicine and health through new drugs, improved agriculture, new materials, synthetic detergents, and personal care products, to name but a few. However, fundamental to hazardous substance management is hazardous identification, risk assessment and control. And although the benefits of the chemicals and other substances are widely accepted, it's often difficult to clearly assess the risks involved in their use, as the knowledge and information necessary to assess and quantify related risks is not available. And it's really important that if we don't know, we err on the side of caution, despite the pressure from a lot of the manufacturers. Regardless, hazard management is fundamental to OHS practice, and a number of systematic approaches have been developed to address this situation. But before we address these systems, it's important to review how these chemicals and other hazardous substances may present in the workplace, and therefore the nature of the potential exposures which need to be managed.